in just the three cases, but mostly the case of Luther, that philosophy is rational. Philosophy keeps saying that man is a rational being, logon, and so on, logon, econ. But it doesn't matter if theology describes its own project as a non-rational project or supra-rational project, which is not the case in Aquinas, but unfortunately the period of equilibrium where one manages with Aquinas to be on the one hand the best theologian, one of the best theologians of one's generation, and on the other hand the best commentator of Aristotle, not making mistakes on Aristotle. By the way, this period of equilibrium is over. And it's over for a reason. Because after Luther, there will be another transition. When we stop speaking of scientia, and something we know very well will appear, it's science. It's possible to speak of science after Bacon and Galileo. It was not possible to have a strict concept of science before, and even the hard sciences before the Renaissance, logic and mathematics, had not developed an epistemology, enabled them to say that they were sciences, they were knowledge. Now, with the Novum Organum and with Galileo, science is here. Science means first experiment. Science means, on the hand, mathematization of the whole of beings. And the consequence follows. Theology is no science, nor is philosophy, with probably the exception of the highly scientific philosophy of Leibniz. The Leibniz project of a Characteristica Universalis is the project of a philosophy able to be the arch science, sort of a far equivalent of what failed in the US in the 20th century as unified science. So, what about theology when it has not to speak with the philosophers, when it is not a science here anymore, or anyway the concept of science here doesn't exist anymore? What of theology after Bacon and Galileo? Answer: theology survives. Theology survives and will survive till the end of the 18th century in faculties of theology, in faculties of theology which have faculties of philosophy in the next lobby, and in a situation where the best philosophers and the best theologians teach outside of the academy. After all, the most creative theologian some years before Luther, Cusanus, was not an academic. He never taught. In the field of philosophy, Descartes never taught, Pascal never taught, Leibniz never taught, Locke never taught, so on. But nonetheless, the universities resist as buildings. Worse, theology as it survives during the period of the conflict of faculties, needs its own philosophy. For after all, founding the academy, one has implicitly or explicitly decided in favor of a two stories universe, nature, supernatural. And if you have a concept of the supernatural, you need to have a concept of the natural. If you have a knowledge of the supernatural, you need to have a knowledge of the natural. And therefore, theology needs a philosophy. Now, philosophy in the patristic period needed probably philosophical concepts, but the theologians never sat to say which is the best available philosophy we might use for our theological purposes. No, they just were working with many people and borrowing what they could borrow. And the period of the conflict of faculties, no, philosophy, theology needs its philosophy. Which is worse, theology needs a philosophy fit to its theological purposes. I've not quoted, I do it now. It's in the days of the medieval universities that one coins the celebrated maxim, Philosophica ancilla Theologica, philosophy as handmaid of the theology. Now, once the philosopher has become free, the theologian does his best to find the handmaid. And the best way of finding the handmaid, when precisely worthy philosophers don't want at all to be handmaidens, is to fabricate it. And what happened later, in the period of decadence of theology, theology retreated into the history of theology. So, at the Sorbonne in the 17th, 18th century, one could find history, good history of theology, or commentaries of medieval authors. The most celebrated commentary we have is not from the Sorbonne, it's from Salamanca, where a gang of Carmelite friars during a whole generation wrote a commentary of Aquinas, the Summa Theologica. A good commentary, it's all. And they are so enthusiastic when commenting Dr. Angelicus that sometime the commentator stops and says, well, the few chapters are so beautifully explained in the Dr. Angelicus that I've only got to be silent, and so we stop 5 questions. Anyway, repetition may be a good thing. I know in some cases it may be a very good thing. And what one finds still the French Revolution in faculties of theology and in the faculties of philosophy next door is repetitive theology and repetitive philosophy. Creation is somewhere else.